Welcome to Regenerative Opportunities. Just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Kevin Marr. I live in upstate New York, and I have been watching with great interest as there's an excellent conversation evolving around the Great Simplification, as defined by Nate Hagens, the Polycrisis, a number of words, but essentially updating that seminal work from 1972, The Limits to Growth, which still continues to generate a lot of heat and argument and controversy. However, I think we are seeing that our way of life and our system with how we interact with the world and organize ourselves is in fact having issues, becoming more unstable. And there's any number of factors that will lend themselves towards this outcome. And I'm going to do a quick overview of 8 factors that feed back into each other and tie together and kind of are driving this sort of breakdown and our way of life and how we've organized ourselves. And I think some of the chaos that we are experiencing is actually due to the fact that the methods and means and tools and approaches we've used to organize ourselves are actually in some trouble. Now, what you have on the screen behind me is a slide that Nate Hagens has put together, and I do not know exactly when he put this together first. And it's called the Carbon Pulse. And I think this is perhaps the best context to really talk about this bigger story, the Great Simplification, the Polycrisis, and opportunities that we have to adapt to it. And I use adapt as opposed to say solve, because I don't think there is a solution in terms of keeping our way of life as is. There will be change. And I think much of that change has actually an opportunity for us to have a greater sense of well-being and a more fulfilling life. Hence the name of this channel, Regenerative Opportunities, because I really do believe there are opportunities. I don't believe we will keep things exactly as is, but so this carbon pulse, in this slide, it's looking back from 1500 to the year 2500, obviously with us centered there just around the year 2000, a little bit after. And I think much of the chaotic feel we have in our world today is because we're probably a little bit closer to that red star at the peak. No one's going to be able to say for certain exactly where we are until well after the fact, most likely. But we are close enough that we should be making this a priority in terms of our focus and our attention. And I'm going to lay out some of these factors that are generally a consequence of how we've organized ourselves over the course of these last few hundred years as we've had access to these fossil fuels that underlie the carbon pulse. But one of the main takeaways for me, I want to start having conversations about how we handle where we are and how we handle the downside of this carbon pulse. Because I am convinced that the rules and the tools and methods that we have used to organize ourselves in this upslope as we took advantage of this one-time gift of fossil fuels are not going to be the same things that will lead to success on the downside of this. And in general, the people that we elect as leaders, the people that we revere, that we hold up for their astute nature and how they've played the game of life, under the rules that were developed with this carbon pulse, are not necessarily following patterns that will be of great benefit, and won't be the rules of the game on the downside. So that's the conversation I want to have. I'm looking forward, hopefully getting some feedback. What do you, I mean, Nate Hagens does a fantastic job at the Great Simplification podcast, laying out so much of this. There's a number of other wonderful blogs and Substacks and posts, but I want to do something that's perhaps a little bit different, a little bit more narrow, because I'm not interested in convincing everyone about this overall picture and what's happening. And there's a lot of people who just aren't ready to see it, or perhaps think, yes, this is probably true in the long term, but we live now and we are paying attention now, and they're not going to waste their time thinking on something that's maybe going to affect their kids, maybe going to affect their grandkids. I think there's a lot of understandable but self-serving perspectives about when this timing hits. We can never know. We're going to push this off, and there's they'll deal with it in the future. I don't think that's ethical, quite honestly. I don't think that's a perspective I want to take and just leave it to the future. And one of the reasons, actually, I think this has been such a pervasive myth is because of all that wonderful, all those resources and energy and the amazing things that enabled on that upslope, has led us to believe and really internalize this view that humanity is just so amazing and clever and creative. The one inexhaustible resource the world has is the human spirit and creativity and so forth. And that has been true during the lives of absolutely everyone on Earth. They're not making it up. This has been our reality for the last couple hundred years. If you always bet on the ingenuity and so forth, that was a winning strategy. This chart here implies something very different. While that sort of rah-rah, go human spirit, go human ingenuity, we don't have to worry about the future, because the future will always be richer and more technologically advanced, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's a way to make the unethical ethical, in my view, where we are leaving problems for the future, problems that we can foresee, that we know are going to happen, because the future is always going to be wealthier. The future is always going to be richer, more technologically advanced. And without the tailwind, tail gale of this amazing energy and the fossil fuels, I think that is certainly something that needs to be called into question. At the very least, we should be having a conversation about it. Because if that's not true, if we really have to be making choices, if there are trade-offs, um, in essence, as a culture, I think we're acting like 5-year-olds. And we need to have a more sober conversation. And here's a quick list of factors. They all tied together. Some I think are pretty well spoken about, or there's conversations. But I don't think there's enough conversations that put all these things on the table and talk about them at once. And in no particular order, starting with one of the ones that I think is of most consequences, but also has a lot of potential for us to really have a positive impact, is ecosystem degradation. Um, Resource constraints, whether they be fossil fuels or minerals, arable land, uh, you know, uh, decline of human health and well-being. Certainly in the United States, that has been uh, an unfortunate reality for us. An overextended financial system. I think financial assets have done tremendously well, but it's widely recognized that we have stretched our capacity for debt and so forth in many uh, realms, and we've all held it together, but everyone can see the risks. Then I would call it the poisoning of life, the pollution, what we are spewing out into the world, um, into the different ecosystems, and within ecosystems, I would consider our the human body and an ecosystem unto itself in a sense. And what are we doing with that pollution? Because in effect, it's poisoning much of life. Um, then a couple of things that I don't know are talked about as widely, or perhaps I think they are generally perceived to be further off than I do. One of which is the end of population growth. In general, we hear somewhere towards the end of the century, towards 2080, 2100, we maybe see a peak in population. But there is some pretty convincing data that shows that may need to be reconsidered. Perhaps we're going to be hitting that within the next 20, 30 years. And then a follow-on from that is something that has sometimes been proposed as something we should aspire to, the end of growth. Um, the idea that growth needs to or will end is anathema to our sort of free market driven society. Um, and the thing is, I believe that there's a very strong possibility that it is not only necessary in terms of the successful continuation of human civilization, but it's not a choice. And in fact, I think when you add up this picture, not only will growth end, but we may very well be much closer to that than we anticipate. And that is, you know, taken together, and in this context of the carbon pulse, obviously this speaks to the resource constraints, and there's ways that we can, perhaps this gets extended. We can add different things. There's tons of nuance and depth and detail that can go into this, but when you look at these overall factors, we need to be having a conversation about how to change how we organize ourselves. And with the regenerative focus in terms of how we engage with ecosystems, agriculture, our land use, our health. Um, y- we have been, so this is sort of the eighth factor that I think ties everything together. And it is something that we need to have in mind as we explore all these varying interlocking issues. And that is, we have developed a delusion that humanity is separate and above the rest of life. I would say that we have been enabled to consider ourselves like that and live like that. In reality, we have in reality lived to a large extent like that because we've had the benefit of this carbon pulse and this extraordinary amount of energy available to us. But this is a short-term factor, and it's not something that we can expect to continue. As laid out here in this slide, the carbon pulse, maybe it's going to be 500 years, maybe less, maybe more. But, it's, I think we actually can draw some pretty hard and fast limits to what we can expect the future to look like. I'll get into that in another episode, but you look to some of the amazing works that have been put together by humans. The cathedrals of Europe, the Great Wall, the pyramids. 500 years is nothing. And I think not only should we take account of these realities and re-engage with the community of life in a way that we are trying to regenerate and increase the amount of life and so forth on the planet in a way that will absolutely benefit us. We need to. So anyways, if anyone's had any sort of spark, positive, negative, I welcome any comments, and I hope to be having some interesting conversations, breaking some of this down. And I thank you for your time. Okay, bye.